Hey everybody, it's Pax. I want to explore a phenomenon in Arkham that I'm going to call urgency, and apply it to two cards that have very similar text, but ultimately feel very different in their usability. We're going to talk about what urgency is, how different game states create urgency, and how urgency impacts card evaluation in regards to these two cards. So let's dive into it. Investigation is one of the core mechanics that almost universally provides progress in a scenario, allowing the investigators to advance the act and eventually reach a positive resolution. Clues tend to be plentiful and low risk due to the minimal negative repercussions upon failing a given investigate test. There is very rarely any consequence for failing to gather clues on this turn, so long as you eventually get those clues on a later turn. Sometimes you can put off getting a ton of clues until the very final turn of a scenario. On the flip side of that, you do eventually need to get them, and the farther along the doom clock moves, the more and more important each test becomes. Damage and horror on your investigator is sort of similar. For the first few points of damage and horror, you can just place it on yourself. But as damage and horror piles up, you eventually enter a game state in which you start initiating tests that can no longer afford to fail, or else you'll lose. Take Roland Banks, sitting at one remaining sanity, and the Mythos phase hands him a rotting remains. Roland puts everything into that willpower test because he's about to die. For both investigation and damage and horror, the investigators start accumulating additional costs to everything they need to do and increase their risk of losing every time the Mythos pushes you. This is the concept I like to call urgency. It's a property of the Mythos in which the importance of a test or action dictates how much effort you need to put into that test or action. Another major source of urgency is enemies, but the urgency of enemies is self-evidently very different. When an investigator is engaged with an enemy, the only actions they can take without triggering an attack of opportunity is to fight, evade, parlay, or resign. The urgency is immediate and dire. If I don't deal with this enemy on me, how do I progress the game at all without just dying? Even if I am able to take a few hits, if my only enemy management solution is fighting, failing to deal with the enemy on this round runs the risk of the next Mythos phase putting you even deeper in the hole with another enemy or a treachery that further restricts you. The urgency of enemies is immediate upon being drawn. The moment that an enemy becomes engaged with you, if you do not have an answer for it, you run the risk of being locked out of the scenario. So the first card I want to talk about is the 45 automatic. It's a 4-cost Guardian asset that takes a hand slot with a single printed agility icon. It is item, weapon, and firearm traded with 4 ammo uses and has the ability activate, spend 1 ammo, fight. You get +1 combat for this attack. This attack deals +1 damage. Right off the bat, I'm a huge apologist for this card. It's not an amazing card, and it's not even a great card, but it's just kind of an appropriate card to deal with something that is urgent. As one of the 2 level 0 Guardian weapons in the core set, this is a card that a lot of players are going to have access to for their Guardians. Yes, I would prefer to have a 45 Thompson for a better combat boost and ammo. Yes, I would prefer to have a machete for a better resource cost and remove the need for ammo in exchange for that engagement requirement. I would also prefer Enchanted Blade for the flexibility to be a knife for when I only need to deal 1 damage. I would prefer the Runic Axe for the campaign long versatility and function. But despite preferring all these options, the urgency of enemies makes it so that the .45 automatic doesn't feel unusable, and frankly ends up in my decks as a redundant weapon to deal with the rare time I'm not finding one of these weapons that I actually want. It's not my first line of defense, but I would far rather have the 45 automatic in hand than not have a weapon at all when the enemies start piling up. The cost isn't great, you don't get a ton of value for it, but you pay the cost because it is a better alternative to just dying. The second card I want to talk about is Fingerprint Kit. Fingerprint Kit is a 4-cost Seeker asset that takes the hand slot with a single printed intellect icon. It is item and tool traded with 3 supplies uses and has the ability activate, exhaust Fingerprint Kit, and spend 1 supply. Investigate. You get +1 intellect for this investigation. If you succeed, you discover 1 additional clue at your location. So, I don't like Fingerprint Kit. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial opinion. I doubt many viewers didn't see this comparison coming from a mile away, nor my opinion on it. But I do find it extremely interesting just how similar these 2 cards read, and how much I just cannot stand using this card. They have the same resource cost, they both provide +1 to the test, and do the base action more efficiently. There's 2 big differences. The first of which is that the Fingerprint Kit exhausts to use. But like we discussed before, the urgency of clues tends to be very low. Maybe Fingerprint Kit will really help your team get through the first few train cars in Essex Express, but it can't gather the 6 clues that it can provide any quicker than across 3 turns. And so it's not useful at an end of scenario situation in which you need to gather a lot of clues very quickly. And that brings us to the second difference, which is having 1 fewer use. Now this makes the card a fair amount less efficient for its cost. So we're left with Fingerprint Kit being costed the same as this weapon, the 45, that is mostly justified by the urgency of enemies. And Fingerprint Kit isn't really capable at dealing with an urgent clue game state. The final point that I really want to make is that clue urgency being so low at the start of the game means that you evaluate the opportunity cost very differently from the .45 automatic. On turn 1, the opportunity cost of playing a .45 automatic is not just weighed against other cards you would otherwise afford, but also against the risk of just dying if you don't play your .45 automatic, if you can't deal with the urgency of an enemy. On turn 1, the opportunity cost of playing Fingerprint Kit is almost entirely against other cards you could otherwise afford, and I think that holding Fingerprint's cost up against a bunch of other similarly costed cards, or even just cards that cost in the 2 to 3 resource range that provide a lot of value over the course of the entire scenario, lays plain why the Fingerprint Kit is just not that good. Arkham Horror is all about risk management, and urgency plays a very integral part in how we evaluate where our efforts are put. I'd love to hear any feedback you have in the comments about what I've talked about today. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.